Yes, I started recording, so please introduce Chris.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Asian Culture Evolution Seminar Series. This is eighth iteration already. Yeah. So I'm happy. So I'm today's chair, Wataru Toyokawa, from Riken. Today we are happy to introduce you, Dr. Chris Kavanagh. So he finished his PhD in Oxford University, in Evolutionary Anthropology department. Worked with Harvey Whitehouse, and then I think Chris, you're still working with Oxford, right? As a group leader position. But
Yes.
yeah, but since 2018, um, you moved also got a position at Rikkyo University, where he's currently doing associate professor position. But yeah, so he's joining us today from Tokyo. So um, yeah, so yeah, Chris, I met Chris in actually in back in Hokkaido University when I was a PhD student. So it's really and it's really exciting for me to catching up academically as well. So yeah, he's going to be talking about a range of topics. You know, focusing on rituals and how rituals functions in a wider social situations, I guess. So yeah, thanks for so much, Chris, for coming. Yeah, stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just see if I can share the presentation, hopefully.
Mhm.
Um, and okay, yeah, right. Permissions. Okay. Sorry, Wataru, just 1 second. It's
No problem. No problem. Takes
the
time.
mm, uh, yeah, yeah. That should be it now. Okay. So okay. Uh, this one. Okay. Hopefully that's visible.
Yeah, we are seeing your slides right now.
Okay. So yes, apologies for all the technical issues. Hopefully things go smoother now. So I'm going to talk about rituals and some of the broader research on rituals, including what rituals are, um, what they might be for, and then talk about some research that myself and collaborators did relatively recently on a cross-cultural study looking at ritual intuitions in four different countries. And then at the end, I'll attempt to uh, combine these different aspects into something coherent. But we'll see. Maybe you can help a little bit with that. And um, I'll mention briefly, just like what Haru said, that I am living in Japan, but originally from Northern Ireland, and I started out in anthropology, social anthropology background, and then switched over to cognitive anthropology and psychology. And I teach in the psychology department, mainly at Rikkyo, but also at ICU and Jose. And I was involved in a variety of large scale projects looking at ritual cross culturally at Oxford. Some of which I'll talk about the results here. Some of the results I won't talk about, and if it but in the discussion section, maybe some of it will come out. And broadly, my research interests are around these different topics, mostly around religion and ritual, but also charismatic gurus and such figures, right? And um, the my background means that in general, the approach that I try to take. Oh, sorry, I think there's there. Okay, some sound came in. Is to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches. It's fair to say that most of my work is now more towards the quantitative side, but the qualitative aspect in anthropology, relying on ethnographies or conducting field experiments, I do think is valuable. So in that respect, I still share a fair bit about my undergraduate training, and my research revolves around a variety of methods, online studies mostly since the pandemic, but before that in small scale laboratory experiments that Wataru was familiar with, and field studies that also he participated in while at Hokkaido. So we conducted research at firewalking festivals across Japan, conducted artificial ritual experiments, getting people to perform rituals in small groups and adjusting environmental effects, and also conducting online surveys with looking at different ritual activities, including things like inaugurations and martial arts promotion ceremonies. And because of my background in anthropology, a few times I have taken part in various dysphoric rituals. So broadly, my research in recent terms revolves around these three areas: the psychological and social effect of ritual participation, and also the kind of dysphoric rituals and their effects in particular. Now, I'm going to ask you for a little dysphoric ritual yourself just to start, because there's one part later that I need an interactive component for. So hopefully this works. This should give you a little code, a QR code, or that you can scan or you can click. And I put up a question because if you interact with it, it will register, right? So we'll see if this works. But the prompt I had was just what is a ritual? No incorrect answers, no correct well, plenty of correct answers, but I'm just trying to get a general approach about people's intuitions. And if it doesn't work, then we can we can move on and I'll answer. But hopefully it will. I see that it's indicating that people are typing, so that's a good sign. I promise there won't be too many of these. so naked man. Okay, that's fairly consistent, actually. Yes, cross-culturally, there are a lot of naked men in rituals and event structure, group, painful, firewalk. I might have primed people with the previous pictures, but we can collective action, community, tattoos, coherence within a group. See, this is not usually what comes up whenever you ask this question. This is what happens when you present to this kind of audience, because all of this is very aligned with what I'm going to talk about. There's one answer indicating a regular activity, right? Structure, belief, group. So all of these things are going to come up. But nice that community is being highlighted by at least more than one person, right? Strengthening social bonds and so on. So all of these are actually pretty good, right? So, but oftentimes people present, things that are mostly focused around religion, right? Or ceremonies or these kind of things. You here are maybe more towards the psychological side of things and evolutionary. So, well, we do have weddings appearing, knocking. I'm not sure what that refers to, but okay. So, thank you for going through this costly display with me. And this will come back later, but you being signed at this will allow you to answer a thing later. And if you haven't, don't worry, it will crop up. So rituals are something that in general, it's hard to identify things which people agree on as human universals, right? Language might be one, subsistence practices, and so on. But rituals are something that most people agree do appear cross-culturally and historically universal. There's no society that we find that we have adequate records of that doesn't appear to have ritual practices. And notably, the rituals, at least in the records that we do have, seem to be clumped around fitness relevant events, right? Things like births, marriages, rites of passage to adulthood, death, warfare, illness. So this makes it an interesting topic for, given that these are so ubiquitous in human society, what are they doing? And why are people investing so much time in it? And when it comes to rituals, they literally are everywhere. Now, it's true when you have like a particular approach and you focus on it, you tend to start seeing them, the features around. You know, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But rituals, what people often imagine rituals to be are like church ceremonies or religious rituals, right? But do you find rituals in sporting events, in cultural ceremonies, in military parades, so on and so forth, right? And there is an argument to be made that simple things like greeting gestures are a ritual, or at least a ritualized behavior, right? In so far as in different cultures, there are different ways that you greet people, different ways that are appropriate, and often it isn't instrumental, right? Except in the sign of indicating a greeting. But there's no reason it should be a bow versus a shake of hands or a kiss on the cheek or whatever the case might be. You also have rituals like the image in the middle, which are relatively unexciting, at least from my perspective, having attended many, many Catholic masses. That does not spark excitement and arousal when I see it. But the thought of doing Vanuatu land diving would, in most people, raise arousal, right? So rituals can be highly emotional or rather boring, right? And they can be individually practiced to a certain extent, like personalized prayer, right? Like the Muslim call to prayer, which can be done collectively or individual. But in a lot of occasions, they are a collective activity. Now, my particular interest is around rituals which involve a little bit more of a cost, because these pose an even bigger puzzle. Why are people stabbing themselves, walking through fire, cutting their backs, putting stinging ants on their hands, or throwing cold water over themselves in the winter, right? And given these are very clear costs, they present an even bigger puzzle, because rituals that involve smaller costs, they might be more explanatory. But if these kind of high cost behaviors persist and they're cross-culturally recurrent, what is the reason? Final point I'll make about ritual diversity is that even in societies where religion is regarded as not particularly important, like Japan, where, according to the majority of surveys, a lot of it depends on the way that you ask things and so on, but people declare that they don't have strong religious affiliations and whatnot. But ritualized performance, very common. So it is normal, as I'm sure most of the people here know, for people to go to Shinto shrines whenever they have young children at 3, 5, and 7. Marriage ceremonies in Christian-like ceremonies are popular, or you can have it at a shrine, and funerals largely associated with Buddhism, right? On top of that, we have evidence across a variety of different sites and materials that rituals existed a long time ago, right? And this includes burial ground materials, cave art, figurines, carved figurines, and this is one of the features that is sometimes used to distinguish like early humans from other related species, right? So ritualized behavior and whether Neanderthals engaged in it was a question that people use to distinguish the two, right? And there also is an evolutionary story, if you like, or proposed framework, which suggests that earlier developing rituals, these rituals which are referred to as imagistic rituals, which I'll talk about later, the ones which generate are kind of more dramatic and involve high arousal, generate strong images. This is where the name came from. That you find evidence of these earlier in the archaeological record. And then as you get the rise of agriculture and writing systems, you start to see doctrinal rituals spread, right? And doctrinal rituals being rituals or being rituals which involve large groups and are often focused around like standardized ritual performances, right? Now, Harvey Whitehouse and colleagues have argued that in terms of what comes first, like they're in a debate with people like Dimitri Zaglatis and Aaron Orenzian and Joe Henrik about whether it's moralizing high gods or rituals that come first. It's no real surprise when a ritual scholar says that rituals are the feature which matter, and when people that are focused on big gods would argue that that's the case. But in terms of their coding, they suggest that social complexity ramps up following the introduction of doctrinal rituals and not when moralizing gods are introduced. But those results are disputed in various vociferous ways. Now, previously, lots of people have noticed that rituals are common. Anthropologists talked about it a lot. Sociologists talked about it. We don't need to spend time talking about the frameworks because in many cases they're not really relying on empirical models, but they're just noting that there is a change over time, right? From rituals moving from these non-doctrinal versions to ones which are more theocratic, as they describe it. Early anthropologists also highlighted that rituals function as a rite of passage. Van Gennep noting that there might have been this cross-culturally recurrent three-phase structure in rituals. There's the evidence for that. Again, we might discuss how strong it is. Victor Turner, a famous anthropologist who often highlighted that the roles in ritual performances are often reversed, where high status individuals can be kind of chastised and so on, and suggested this formed like a social or psychological function for giving people an outlet. And then again, you have people like Mary Douglas focusing on taboos and suggesting there were relationships between the way that people classify different substances, right? Now, all of these are interesting theories. Might mention as well Durkheim and collective effervescence, but the thing that they lacked often was empirical grounding. More recently, people have been focusing on the topic again, really over the past 2 or 3 decades. And the difference this time is that there is an emphasis being placed on empirical work, right? So I'm going to talk about some of that, what that is. And but first, since I have now done a little tour around ritual theory, it would make sense to explain what a ritual is, right? Perhaps that might have been the first thing to do, but Laguerre and Souza said rituals can be defined as a socially stipulated group convention, which is nice and simple. You can see the definition offered by Hobson et al. There's a lot of definitions that go round. And generally, I favor a family resemblance type definition where you see these characteristics, right? Rigidity, adherence to a script, causal opacity, repetition and redundancy, socially prescribed and transmitted sequences that are symbolically dense and potentially involve goal demotion. I'll talk about what some of those involve, but synchrony and repetition is quite straightforward. People performing the same things and enacting the same sequences. Causal opacity, on the other hand, is where there are things performed, and really the distinction is between them having a clear instrumental purpose, right? When you think of if you came across these implements in the field, for example, there is the notion that there is some purpose for which they are, but the way in which these would interact together would be likely unknown, right? Unless you're familiar with the ritual sequence. And in the case where people perform rituals, it is not always clear that they know things. So, like, for example, when it comes to omikuji in Japan, right? Or if you like a Christian example, lighting prayers or saying prayers or lighting candles whenever somebody's sick. So the mechanism by which that will heal the person is vaguely associated with like supernatural forces. But when somebody like says a prayer at a shrine for somebody to pass an exam, are they imagining that the kami is like traveling over to help the person in the exam and like blasting them with like beneficial power? In general, people won't say that is the case, but there is the notion that doing the ritual performance will have some effect on the outcome. Similarly, whenever people get bad luck from omikuji, the fortunes at shrines or temples, they will generally tie them right to the railings or wherever they're supposed to be. Now, if you ask people why, I think in general the answer would be that's what you're supposed to do, or maybe some people would say it's bad luck, right? If so, you should leave it there. But then many people also tie the good luck responses there, right? So I don't think that people tend to think about the specific kami mechanics or metaphysical causation or any formal doctrine. So causal opacity doesn't mean that you don't know what the point of the ritual performance is, but the mechanism is not so straightforward, right? And in terms of things being socially prescribed and transmitted, so this is important because habits are not rituals. Habits like getting a shower every day or brushing your teeth are sometimes called daily rituals, but they are not the same as the academic definition, because habits by their nature are generally individual, right? They can be socially derived, but they rarely are causally opaque. They don't tend to have repetition and redundancy, and they very often are instrumental. Like you get a shower to get clean, you brush your teeth to clean your teeth. So there's not that causal opacity. So there might be ritualized behaviors that people engage in, but habits by themselves are not rituals. And myself and colleagues also conducted a factor analysis looking at ethnographic accounts of rituals and then contemporary ritual experiences, and found them clustering around these predictable areas, right, that we anticipated from ritual theory. So we might talk about some of these, but they were making those kind of predictions would not be possible if we were just like predicting around habits, right? Because there's too much variety and so on there. So one suggestion, which I think is pretty good, is that Matt Rossino's suggestion that there is a typology of rituals, and you can distinguish between these three categories: ritualized behavior, infant caregiver rituals, and community rituals. Ritualized behaviors you see in the animal kingdom, in threat displays, mating dances, and similar sorts of presentations. And this is where the actual behavior has been emancipated from the performance, right? Threat displays don't require that you then go and fight. They're often done in the stead of that, and they have a specific form that they're supposed to be presented in. Katas in martial arts kind of potentially part of that system, because you're taking like a repertoire of particular moves outside and performing it in a set structure, right? Even though there is supposed to be a functional component of it. Now, if you find ritualized behaviors in humans and animals, there are things that you do not find in animals, which are cultural rituals, right? These are things like the Orthodox Mass that you can see, or the Tibetan shamanic performances. And these have the features that you find in ritualized behavior, but also have a lot of symbolism and kind of increased scale, right? Set roles for people to perform, ritual authorities, so on. And they are transmitted socially, not via, like in animals, in not all mating behaviors, for example, are transmitted right via social learning. Like the pufferfish, very impressive, but they're not teaching each other how to do that. There's some discussion whether there is non-human cultural rituals, and there's some candidates for that, but generally, and the one that gets most attention is this throwing of rocks in hollow trees by chimpanzees. But there, it's ambiguous, right? And it's nothing like what we see in humans, whereas in human societies you find elaborate rituals all over the place. Now, Matt Rosno suggested that infant caregiver rituals function as the bridge between these kind of ritualized behaviors to the more developed cultural references. And you can see features and studies there around, children's propensity to want to engage in ritual performances and structured play. And this becomes increasingly elaborated as their cognitive capacity increases, right? And there's some studies suggesting that rituals, these features that we talked about here, the 6 listed there, serve as signals for a particular approach when people see them. Like, so when children see these kind of things from adults, they adopt a particular stance, one that involves over imitation, right? And this includes like copying non-instrumental actions and so on. There's research done by Christine Laguerre and Mark Nielsen in particular that has focused on this topic and emphasized that over imitation could be argued to be like humans' superpower, right? Rowan Kapatny as well, looking at if you have action sequences where you change the start and end state or vary aspects around how instrumental they are, that we see higher fidelity copying whenever there are more ritual components. I think people here are probably familiar with the research on imitation and over imitation in chimpanzees and humans, right? Showing that humans, infants, and adults have a better or a stronger propensity than other primates to copy non-instrumental actions. And this seems to be because of things like them perceiving that it has a instructional feature, right? Perhaps due to shared intentionality aspects that Michael Tomasello has talked about. So in this respect, rituals can function as a means of providing high fidelity transmission of sequences, cultural norms, behaviors, and so on. And so people, including Christine Laguerre and Mark Nielsen and Harvey Whitehouse, have talked about a ritual stance being activated. I've seen this in function whenever people have went to visiting scholars went to like expensive sushi restaurants and the staff performed in a ritualistic fashion. They delivered the nice sushi in a like very ritualized format, and the result was that everybody kind of stopped talking and paid attention and tried to be respectful. So these signals can, I think, serve even when you're not familiar with the particular cultural motifs. People notice rituals, right? So that's what rituals are. Another question is, what are rituals for? And like I said, many people have had many theories about that. I already covered some of them. Freud had his own suggestion about there being connections between like OCD, obsessive acts, and religious practices. This was a topic that a lot of people have been interested in. Some of the answers that I think have better empirical support include the suggestion by Pascal Bayer and Pierre Léonard that rituals are related to a hazard precaution system. Now, in their case, they're actually focusing here on ritualized behavior. This is what they wanted to argue for, but their own paper ends up referencing cultural rituals as well. So I don't think it is only that, but they also draw a connection to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Which one of the diagnostic criteria is ritualized behaviors. And in that respect, rituals, the fact that they tend to, or at least according to Pascal and Pierre, they tend to often involve around cleansing and removal of ritual pollution. They may be activating a kind of hazard avoidance psychology. And in this respect, it's kind of a byproduct, right? That we have hazard avoidance to avoid contamination and contact with things that will cause us illness and harm. But this psychology can be activated by ritual performances of things that like activate cleansing mechanisms, or the kind of psychology that feeling clean activates, and this leads to anxiety reduction. So it may be that it's kind of hitching a ride, right, on a evolved hazard avoidance mechanism. And they talk about ritual performances by the nature of focusing down on these discrete action steps lead to people feeling alleviating anxiety from higher order rumination, right? This also relates to research by Martin Lang and others saying that ritual performance appears to do well at alleviating anxiety. In some studies, they've put people in stressful situations and seen if they observe more ritualized behaviors, things like, repetitive cleaning. They give them a task for cleaning a statue in one particular study. But in a similar way, the argument here is that rituals are serving a psychologically useful function, but not necessarily one that was adaptive originally. In this case, rituals as hazard avoidance mechanisms or as anxiety alleviating, this might be a spandrel effect where they're hitchhiking on a system for evolving like actual environmental contamination rather than social contamination. Rituals also, you find a lot of them whenever you have situations with uncertainty or risky outcomes, right? Gambling or sports events or harvests of crops, these kind of things. So shamans, similarly, Manveer Singh's work indicates that shamans very often provide services, right, to cure ailments or help alleviate uncertainty around future performances, divinations, and so on. So in this case, shamans are ritual experts that are helping to manage uncertainty via this interaction with invisible, unseen forces, right? So in this respect, rituals and shamans as ritual experts are part of a broader cultural tool set that is for use in managing uncertainty. And perhaps the topic that has received the most attention is rituals' ability to bond people together, especially collective rituals that involve synchrony and high arousal. This is my own area of interest. I'm not now going to talk about the research on like the firewalking rituals, but this is what we were interested in. Are people behaving more pro-socially afterwards, right? And in this sense, rituals are suggested to be social bonding tools that create physiological and psychological unity, if you like. And the fact that you can find synchronized performances in things like militaries or in sporting events and so on, seem to suggest that there is some validity to this. When it comes to painful rituals, as mentioned, there's been a fair amount of research on that. And given that painful rituals are very common, right, and require clear cost to take part in them, there has been the suggestion that like this in particular is a evolutionary puzzle, right? And two of the solutions suggested are a signaling expression that they serve as a clear and hard to fake signal of commitment, and secondly that they, via their mechanisms, lead to increased bonding within the group, right? And some of this relates to Harvey Whitehouse's model, where he suggests that different types of rituals lead to different types of bond. The doctrinal type that we talked about leading to more categorical bonds, and the imagistic ones leading to these more intense relational ties. Research has found cooperation increasing after people perform synchronous activities, and there is some research around communities that evolve more costly rituals performing better or lasting longer. And the last thing that I'll mention is that there is a suggestion that initiation rituals, which are again a relatively common feature, might be an evolutionary affiliation technology, if you like, where newcomers to a group are kind of forced to endure a cost in order to get access to group resources, right? And the things which point this way are that hazing or painful group initiations are temporary performances, always done in the direction of newcomers from more experienced members, and there is some evidence that they appear to be more common in groups that have access to more resources. This is automatic accrual theory by Aldo Simino. Now, briefly, I'll also just mention that my ex-supervisor and the person I worked with a lot at Oxford, Harvey Whitehouse, he has a model of the modes of religiosity, and its argument is essentially focused on these two clusters of rituals, imagistic rituals and doctrinal rituals. The argument isn't that there are other types of rituals, it's that these two groups are like attractor positions, the ones that are rare and highly arousing and frequent but low arousing, and that these different types of rituals are associated with different types of groups, different types of spread, and as mentioned, this is due to activating different types of bonds, right? And part of the theory is that this is different psychological mechanisms. But all of that is to say, I'd be interested in people's thoughts, right? But rituals appear to serve, or at least there's a lot of theory suggesting that there are functional purposes for them. There, it was probably a whole heap of different different theories and connections proposed, right? And the strength of evidence varies between them. But the point I wanted to make by going through them is that we have a lot of theories now, but the empirical evidence that we have is somewhat less developed, right? So we do have some good cross-cultural studies, but majoritively you've got smaller, non-pre-registered studies, reliant as most are on weird samples. And you also have the issue that a lot of the theories seem rather fluid in terms of like accommodating evidence, right? So for that reason, I think it's important that we now try to focus in this area on testing predictions against like better quality data, right? And trying to prune the field and put different theories head to head. So the cultural toolkit hypothesis, if you like, maybe I don't know, hypothesis, theory, idea, whatever way you want to put it, is that rituals in general are often associated with collective action problems, and they appear to have functional roles, some of which I've discussed. So we, in this study that I'm now going to turn to talk about, we're interested in looking at whether, if we present people with ritual tasks or ritual scenarios, do they display the same intuitions about which collective action problems those rituals would be appropriate for, right? So some possibilities are that there are similar intuitions cross-culturally because of universal cognitive features, right? Secondly, could be exposure to different religious traditions gives you shared intuitions that people who are not familiar with those traditions don't have. Cultural and socio-ecological environments might explain it, right? If you come from an orthopraxic or orthodoxic environment. Alternatively, it could be modern media and representations in movies and manga, or globalization of American culture that explain patterns. Or it might be that it's all randomly distributed and people don't have any intuitions about rituals. That's a fairly easy null hypothesis to knock down, but it's possible, right? So we went to look at this, and the way that we did it was that we took these 8 types of rituals, which were based on a coding of rituals initially by Quentin Atkinson and Harvey Whitehouse, where they coded rituals in ethnographic materials, and then also our attempt to look at the morphospace of ritual representation. So you can see these descriptions here, okay? The doctrinal is, like, if you like, the kind of Christian mass, imagistic being the more imagistic mystery cult, like extreme ritual, and then you have others, right? Divination, people trying to predict the future, fiesta types. These are the type that you would associate with like matsuris, processions, singing and dancing, trance performances, ones which associated with shamanism, washing ceremonies, confessions, and animal sacrifice. There were more, but this is the 8 that in piloting we found this was a reasonable amount for people to be able to keep track of, right? So we then presented participants with 6 scenarios that involved like collective action problems, and they were asked to imagine that they were an authority on traditions and rituals for a community, right? So it's a kind of vignette study, and we had different variations for each of the scenario just to make sure that it wasn't particular wording that was producing a specific effect, but each participant only saw one, right? So these are the scenario types. You had hostile outgroup threat, environmental threat, factional division, in-group distrust, risky resource collection, and collective donations. And these were all intended to relate to collective active action problems that the ritual literature has suggested that rituals are particularly relevant for, right? And we tried to also keep it so that the description was as culturally neutral as possible. Obviously, we translated it in the different scenarios, but we avoided, so like here where it says confession, or it didn't say that in the actual thing, right? That's just to highlight what the rituals are associated with. And then we asked people to rank the rituals from top to bottom in terms of what they would consider most appropriate, right? So here is an example, okay? Now, I'm not going to read this because I'm going to ask you to rank the ritual you would consider most appropriate for this scenario, right? And to read it, in recent weeks, the community has been growing more anxious due to growing distrust and suspicion among community members following several recent unsolved thefts of important resources. So hopefully you have the ability to rank there, and if you would, I would appreciate people doing that. And I'll move on quick. Now, Wataru, just to mention, also, I think I started like 8 minutes or so late, so I'll try to still finish around an hour, but
No problem.
yes,
Yeah. You're still on time.
okay. Okay, people appear to be ranking now, and don't feel obliged to like rank precisely every, like that's a lot of rituals, right, that you had to just see flashed up for a couple of seconds. So whichever ones that you have there are in your memory, like the top 2 or 3 are fine for you just to place into order. And we'll have a look at a second at the result. And I should say as well that all the samples were online samples from, I believe, Prolific, or it might have been, in some cases, Mechanical Turk. It's not immediately clear to me, but I think the majority were from Prolific, or in the case of Japan, it would have been Lancers. Okay. So if you're ranking, please continue, because it will show up. We've got 6 people that have ranked so far. When we get to 10, I'll make it appear. Okay. Okay, so now we're influencing people's results, right? You can feel the pressure, social pressure, Ash conformity of the answers. But so here, okay, we see it's not randomly distributed, or at least it doesn't appear to be. It looks like the large ceremony and disclosure, which is the confession style ritual, is prioritized, and then we have animal sacrifice, divination, and so on further down, right? So there's a clear preference here for large ceremony and disclosure. Let's see if it goes like that. But that's what we ask people to do. We also ask people their threat perception, how threatening they ranked the scenario. They provided a rationale, often very brief. And this was before AI. It was common, I should say, as well. So at least the results were not AI generated. And we had some other measures: belief in God, supernatural belief scale, to try and capture a more culturally neutral measurement, religious affiliation, if people had a current religion and if they were brought up in a religion, age, sex, ethnicity, and also exposure to ritual in media in this self-reported scale from 0 to 100. Okay, and the analysis that we did, we only took the top 3 ranked choices because it seemed like the majority of all our information was noise, right? And this was not an arbitrary decision. We did consult the literature and pre-register it, and we used an ordinal regression with various things that you can see there. If you disagree with any of those choices, it's Matthew Brown who you can blame, because he was the person who recommended this particular approach. So in general, we were looking for model improvement, right, in nested models. When we add in predictors, what improvement does it make to the model? So the first sample was in the UK, 700 people from Prolific, which you can see the details of there. Not a very high belief in God, but a lot of people that were raised Christians. And here is the result. So this is showing the relative proportion of ranked preferences, right? So the bigger representation, the higher the scores. Now we scored like a 1 as higher, right, than a third place ranking, and so on. So you can see here it's not randomly distributed. You find the doctrinal ritual, which is the kind of Christian mass style ritual, is represented. But you can see, and you can see like consistencies across a lot of them. Like imagistic is very rarely selected, and sacrifice also relatively low. However, there is variation, right? Like in risky resources and environmental threat, you see more sacrifice choices. In group distrust, which is the answer, was the one that you did, in group distrust or factional thing. But in any case, if we look, we can see that the confession rituals strongly represented in these two clusters, right? Which kind of matches the results that we saw there. If it was factional division, then it's an exact match. But so overall, doctrinal rituals were the most preferred across categories, and then the procession fiesta type, confession, washing, divination. So the results overall showed substantial variation across the different scenarios, but also some consistent patterns. Doctrinal rituals were most common, followed by the procession fiesta type, and then washing rituals. And the environmental threat and risky resource extraction scenarios rather nicely showed more representation from divination and sacrifice type rituals, which is aligned with, theory suggesting that those kind of ritual or those kind of uncertain outcomes will be the kind of thing that people want to control via these rituals, which are trying to ward off evil or predict the future. And disclosure rituals, which are confessions, really were highly ranked in factional division and group trust. So it seems that there is a connection between intergroup conflict and confession style rituals. And we found, when we were looking at the different models predicting this, that we didn't get very much additional power from adding in things like any of the religious measures, ritual exposure, age or sex. And this was also the case for ritual religious background, nor the threat measures, right? So the vast majority of the work in the model was done by the type of ritual and then the interaction of the ritual type and the scenario. So next, we decided to do this in the US to see, given that they're such a strange country, are they like the UK people? In the results, they're both like historically Christian. And as you can see, there's more Christians here. There's a much higher level of belief in God. And otherwise, specific American cultural differences. We also added in here, I know it's not good to add things in mid study, but Harvey Whitehouse wanted us to add in a particular scenario because we didn't see what we anticipated around imagistic rituals emerging in really any of the scenarios, right, as a particular thing. So Harvey wanted to look at if there is a specific thing where there is a smaller group engaging in an imagistic or the group is engaged in a kind of activity to protect the group, right? Will this be something which invokes imagistic rituals? Because this is part of what like Harvey suggested, that you would see these more. So we didn't change the other ones. We just added this in as an additional scenario. And when we looked at the results, so as you can see, doctrinal rituals still represented across most conditions, and also the fiesta type here as well, although not very much, right, in the in-group distrust. Confession rituals, again, overrepresented in in-group distrust and factional division. And happily for Harvey, imagistic rituals emerged as much more common in this case where you had the small group of people scenario. Right now, it might be that there is a reason for that association, but in any case, this is obviously different from all the other patterns that we see. When we put the two results together, with overall rank preference, you can see quite similar, right? So there is a comparison or a fairly similar pattern when it comes to the two weird Christian background samples. And again, in this case, same pattern. Whenever we looked at the predictive power, we found that it was buoyed up by looking at the ritual type and ritual type scenario. It did increase when we added in demographic measures and age and sex and so on, but it was a very minor improvement to the model, almost giving nothing, right, of note. So yes. So overall, replicated the pattern. Doctrinal rituals more common. Environmental threat and risky resource showed, again, divination and sacrifice rituals being prioritized, and confession rituals highly ranked in the factional division in group distrust. And then we have the special defender result that you saw, right? So last then, we moved to India and Japan, the cross-cultural samples. And we pre-registered this because we had the predictions from the previous study, or we had, sorry, the patterns. So these were the things that we pre-registered, and we weren't entirely sure in some cases whether these were patterns that would be specific to a like a Christian background tradition, but we noted, divination rituals, that we expected them to be more prevalent in the environmental threat and risky resource scenario. These are the demographics, 700 and 760 participants in both cases. As you would expect, Hindus, the majority in India, in Japan, none, and then Buddhists. But also in Japan, when you measure things via the supernatural belief scale or belief in God, you don't get such low scores, but obviously somewhat comparable to the UK in terms of belief in God, right? But India, much higher to be expected. So what did we see when we look at the patterns? Well, we saw this. So it might be somewhat hard to detect the patterns in this representation. So I'll summarize them in a minute. But one thing that is notable, I think clearly, is that in India, you've got a much more evenly distributed representation from the different rituals, right? And this might reflect the diversity of ritual traditions that you see in India. It could also be, or people, when I previously talked about this, said maybe Indian people were just randomly selecting, but that did not seem to be the case according to the quality checks that we had in the data. And actually, you still got some of the same patterns. It's just that they're relatively less large, right, compared to the other cases. Now, in Japan, the interesting thing was that the procession ritual was more commonly represented, right? In other cases, we had sort of somewhat similar patterns, more representation of certain rituals, but this kind of expanded band around the procession fiesta type is notable. And if I put them together, okay, I know this kind of chocolate cake layered presentation might be a little bit hard to interpret visually, but I mean, I think the most notable thing here is that in these two countries, right, you're seeing the confession being represented here, whereas in the case of India and Japan, there's much less variation there. When it comes to risky resources and environmental threat, you're interested in the relative level of divination, and you don't quite see the same level of variation, right? So if we look at overall ranked preference, you can see here, right? Doctrinal highest in the two Western countries. In Japan, it's high, but it's basically on par with the procession type rituals. In India, on the other hand, you have a fairly consistent one across other ones. So Japan, similar to the UK and US in certain respects, but without the kind of emphasis on doctrinal rituals that you saw. And when we looked at the um, all samples combined, predictive things, right? We did see a difference between the two countries, right? Like collecting them together into weird versus non-weird, and then UK, US versus Japan and India. But as you can see here, right, the models were really they were improved by adding them. But again, the majority of the legwork was done by the ritual type and ritual type scenario category, and there was more added in this case by the kind of religious exposure and so on. So overall, Indian samples displayed more diversity in choice of rituals. Yet the relative rankings within that less constrained diversity, or sorry, bigger pattern of diversity was the same. And Japan had a similar pattern, but a kind of closer match between doctrinal and fiesta type rituals, right? So cross-culturally, there was a dominant preference for doctrinal and fiesta rituals in all countries, which matches with this being an attractor position that, as discussed in the ritual modes, but also other models. Confessional rituals were preferred in intergroup conflict scenarios. This was also found in India and Japan, but it was a less substantial effect, right? So that suggests that it may be something to do with confession rituals being something that you find in Christian environments more, but we'd need like Muslim samples and so on to look at that. And divination rituals were consistently associated with environmental and risk resource extraction in the UK, US, in Japan, which aligns with the patterns that we expected. In terms of like the other things that we measured, the only real notable thing was that there was what we referred to as like an Indiana Jones effect, where exposure to ritual presentation in media was associated for like more likely choice to select imagistic rituals, sacrifice, and trance categories, which may relate to, you know, like their representation in media, these more dramatic rituals. So some surprising results are that there were no strong associations between belief in God scores or supernatural belief and ritual rankings. And this could be due to the cross-cultural comparisons swamping out the variants, right? Higher ranking observed for confession rituals in the US, and there was an association with doctrinal and procession rituals being preferred with age and a decreased preference for sacrifice and imagistic type rituals. So I've talked a lot now, and I just will reiterate to give time to hear feedback from people about any of that, the results or the previous discussions, that we have an issue that the field is very rich, but there's a lot of potential for just so stories or unfalsifiable theories occurring. And you know, with the replication crisis in social sciences and the hard sciences, we and the early nature of the field, there's a chance to avoid the mistakes. So there's some findings, like things that more procedural steps and rituals lead to like greater consideration of efficacy and so on. But many of these, almost all of them, need to be replicated in large cross-cultural samples, right? And in many cases, the design is actually simple, so it should be, you know, a relatively straightforward thing to do if people have sufficient motivation. So, especially the field that's typically involved with this is cognitive science of religion, right? So, I am encouraging myself and others to try and avoid like collecting a bunch of smaller studies with like interesting results that happen to align with a preferred theoretical model, usually of the particular author, right? And hopefully the study that I just talked about, we avoided some of that, but it is still very much an exploratory at an exploratory stage. Okay, so yes, and this is my collaborators, and thank you, people supporting me, and thank you all for listening. And I'll welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. We have already one person raising your hand. So Philip, please go ahead.
Hi, Chris. Good to see you. Thanks for the talk. This was really, really good talk. I have one question which might not surprise you, which is you talked a lot about rituals and that they incur a cost. How does this apply to the discourse space, like to verbal rituals and for example, like, this ritualistic lying that we're seeing currently in politics, as part of group belonging. Would you think that there's a relationship? I'm referring specifically to Peter Turnberg, who is an assistant professor in Amsterdam, who makes this argument that with the digitization, kind of also the rituals moved. So he's a Durkheimian kind of social computational anthropologist or sociologist. And he makes the argument that with the discourse shifting online, rituals also shifted with it. Do you see something like that happening, or is that too premature to say?
Well, I'd
Thank
say
you.
that the easier thing, and thank you for the question, Philip, the easier thing in the online environment is to see like expression of costly beliefs, right? Because it's easy to represent in text, and there's plenty of arguments that these kind of professions of things which are counterintuitive or politically aligned, right? That they serve as signals of group identity as much as they do of beliefs. But on TikTok and Instagram and various other platforms, there are the emergence of people performing like what are pretty much classical rituals, right? People conducting spells or doing digital style divination and so on. And these are incredibly popular, which I think speaks to the fact that, they have not gone away. They are popular amongst young people in online spaces. And yeah, so it would not surprise me at all that you see new types of rituals emerge in those spaces. But I would think that the features will probably largely stay the same. When virtual reality gets better, maybe you'll actually see extremely dramatic ritual performances. But I don't think we're quite there yet for that. But yeah, so I think they're there. It's just a matter of where you look.
Okay. And so Kenji's, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the talk, Chris. I have a question about the interpretation of your results
Mm.
and about the choice of the types of rituals against the types of the purposes. So my question is that do your results just suggest that people share the interpretation about the functions of types of rituals, or can you argue anything about the needs that have given birth to specific types of rituals against specific needs or something? Yeah.
Mm-mm. Yeah, so I think the extent to which the results represent, we try to control in certain ways for things like um, relative familiarity from cultural sources, but obviously we have imperfect measures for that. And the scenarios and the rituals that we presented were not like selected at whim. They were, in most occasions, selected specifically to address things which are suggested in the literature to be like recurrent collective action problems that specific type of rituals are associated with or better suited to solving. Now, whether people would know that from, the kind of cultural discourse around rituals, for example, I think is something that you could suggest. But in most occasions, whenever we were doing piloting or these kind of things, like people don't have clear understandings about they might have the notion that rituals are about bonding or these kind of things, but I think it would be hard to find a human that doesn't have some association about like rituals and specific types. So yes, we did have reasons for like, so in particular, just for example, we looked at risky resource collection, right? And this was ones that were the scenarios presented that there was danger, and these are specifically presented as in the literature as the kind of scenarios where people would favor imagistic style rituals, right, to create better bonding. Now, of course, the people in our study, like, it's not clear that like people would have intuitions about what the appropriate social function, for a ritual would be. But we were interested in just, does that exist? Like, is there an intuition where people, imagine that these kind of rituals might work better in that case? And similarly, when it comes to like collective donations, for example, that's something that's supposed to be associated with doctrinal rituals, that they're particularly good at getting people in large groups to provide for, contribute to public goods or pro-social in-group donations. So most of them were designed with the intention of invoking scenarios that people have referenced as rituals and particular types of rituals being very associated with. And in terms of like the ritual categories that we came up with, that was derived from Quentin Atkinson and Harvey Whitehouse's attempt to identify the most common rituals in the ethnographic literature cross-culturally, and the follow-up study that we did, where we tried to look at if people are self-generating rituals in a bunch of different countries, what kind of rituals do they self-generate? Do they talk about? And these 8, there was originally, I think, a list of 15, and then we kind of piloted it, and obviously that was too long for people to pay attention to. So over iterations, we reduced it down, but they're all supposedly rituals which are cross-culturally represented to a certain extent, and which you find throughout the ethnographic and historical literature.
Thanks. So, like in your talk, you said that like most rituals are the causality of most rituals are unclear, right? So you mean that even though people do not know how it functions, but they somehow knows the functions of rituals, and the types of functions are somehow universal or typical across cultures. Can I
Yes.
understand your argument?
Well,
Okay.
at least that's possible. And there's these two different things which are sometimes conflated, which is goal demotion and causal opacity, right? And causal opacity is that you don't know the mechanistic connections. Goal demotion being you don't know the purpose. And in most rituals, people do know the purpose of the ritual, right? From cultural exposure, they just are often not clear about the mechanistic relationship. So it is really in causal opacity, which is, I think, the more common thing, rather than, so when people are talking about like some people do suggest goal demotion is a common feature of rituals, but in my experience, most people can explain the purpose of a ritual. They just can't like explain how it will achieve it.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Any other questions from the floor? There's one question posted in the chat. Martin, would you like to ask him, or would you like me to read it and ask him on your behalf? Yeah, I think I can just so from Martin. Oh yeah, the Martin's mic is terrible. So yeah, I can do it. Please may I ask if there seems to be a market in rituals. For example, funerals should be helping put the dead to rest, but we see undead banishing rituals too. For example, like the staking, vampires, etc. So is it possible that rituals experience market forces, like innovation, upselling, etc.?
Yeah, yes, it's a good question, and it's definitely true. Like the Manveer Singh, who I referenced, talks about shamans operating as a profession, right? And they're offering ritual services, and most rituals are associated with professions, either ritual performance or specialists offering rituals that do specific things. So there are institutions and there are in some cases like individual livelihoods associated with it. And if you look at it from like a kind of cultural group selection point of view, you have different religious groups and communities, even like within religions and between religions, competing over followers and believers, right? And you can see in the case of Japan, there's a division of labor, right, between the different religions and the functions that they serve. Buddhism associated with funerals, Shinto with like blessing and childhood ceremonies, and Christianity with marriages, if anything. So there is like a functional division, and you also do see people innovating new types of rituals or new associations, like services for aborted fetuses, for example, in shrines located next to red light districts in Japan. And in that case, there was an ethnography talking about the marketing of the menacing fetus, kind of like, Japanese horror and similar sort of motifs. Uh, Commonly found in new religious movements as well, suggesting that like if you do not perform the rituals for the children that you have aborted, that it will lead to problems in your life. And similarly, you can see like the history of religion, theological disputes over very often are associated with like ritual traditions. So some Christian traditions say you shouldn't do baptism when you're a child, you should do it when you're older. And these might seem like minor issues, right? Or some Buddhist groups saying that you should chant the first line of the Lotus Sutra rather than do zazen meditation or whatever the case might be. But in all those cases, they've often been associated with like wars or state repression of different traditions and so on. So it is definitely the case that there is market forces at play and that rituals are um, things which are active in markets, and also that they serve as differentiating um, features for different groups to compete with and represent themselves as being different through. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, sure.
Mm. Hi, Chris. Thank you for the talk. I noticed that in your experiment, you give them a scenario which is a threat. And I'm wondering whether, like in general, you observe that the countries or cultures with more threat in general, they have richer rituals, like just generally richer rituals.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So you mean like the ones which are more, for whatever reason, environmentally, politically, or like climate, more uncertainty that they
Yeah.
respond differently. Um, well, the answer would seem to be yes, because there, but I think it's in our sample that's conflated with the cultural and religious differences as well. So, like, India and Japan are, according to like pathogen prevalence and, other indicators, like more risky environments than the US and the UK. But then we also have the issue that and we did see greater ritual diversity in both Japan and India. But it's only two countries. So we'd need a bigger sample to do it. But I think it would be a perfectly reasonable thing to test and look at, like not just self-perception of threat, but historical exposure to different types of threats, or maybe like contemporary threats as well. So yeah, so yes, that is true, but I only have two data points that I can draw from in this sample.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, taking advantage of this sharing, let me ask one question as well. So in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned you also did some behavioral experiments. And I'm just curious, what did you do there? Because I'm asking this because the data you presented today is mostly kind of asking people, like what kind of type of rituals they would prefer to implement in certain situations. Um, then as you showed, there are patterns and so on. But I think the one thing is lacking there is whether these preferred types of ritual actually having this function. Like, they're expecting for those rituals to have certain function in this situation, but it's not directly testing that, right? So I imagine,
Yes.
therefore, like you did the experiment, and then to see if such an function is actually operating on. So is it like my guess is correct, or this is
Yeah.
why you did the experiment?
Yeah, so we have done behavioral experiments and we have done field research, as you know, right? Looking at in firewalking festivals or getting people to perform like rituals in group scenarios. And in those contexts, like one, well, I think the field research is perhaps like the better test of it, because the rituals there are more like there's more like cultural connection to them, and also they can do things that we can't, right? Like get people to walk through fire, and so on. But actually, in those cases, for example, some of the results we found are perhaps not surprising, but at the various firewalking research, we found that people that participate and that post the ritual event show a greater endorsement of exclusive identities, like local identities associated with the ritual. So like in our case in Japan, it was around like the local town versus the Japanese identity. In other research, it was around like a parochial religious identity versus a national identity, but like nobody's going to identify with like Shinto, right, in Japan. So we did see more exclusive identity endorsed, and this being stronger amongst the people that are performing firewalking rituals. But what we didn't see, and which we expected to see, was more relationships with pain and prosocial behavior. There was no correlation with that. And also there was limited evidence for like strong shifts in identity, right? So we tried to replicate a finding based on Mauritius, but we didn't see a strong increase in prosocial behavior. We did see more exclusive identity, but that was counter to the results in Mauritius. And we saw some support for like identity fusion type mechanisms, but it was only in the like high arousal firewalking Shinto events, not the Buddhist firewalking ones. So at least in those kind of fieldwork studies, we do find effects, but they're much more muted than has been reported in previous studies. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, so that's, as you said, we need more like a data from either from field works or like behavioral. Yeah, fascinating. Cool. Yeah, then there's another one from Sakura. Please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so I have two quick questions. So the one is, maybe I've like missed something from your slide. that, or maybe you tested it in the paper but didn't present it here. But I'm wondering whether people's intuitions actually matching, are they actually matching with the actual functions of the rituals? So that is like, have you tested whether the rituals that are deemed to be powerful in people's intuition, are they actually more powerful to, for example, increase group cohesion, or are they more powerful to reduce anxiety? So that's my first question. Can I continue, or would you like to first respond?
I'll remember that one. You can
Okay, great.
continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second question is, I'm just like, I just don't know much about this field, but what are just those stories in evolutionary psychology in this field of rituals? So that's my second question.
Okay. So the first one is whether people's intuitions map onto like reality, right? And whether we have evidence for that. And I would say not in this paper we don't, right? Because we're just asking people about their general intuitions, but the broader literature does have good evidence about associations. Now, the extent to which those are well supported empirically varies between types of ritual and collective action problem. Like I would say the literature around rituals are associated with like divination or making predictions about the future or so on, being associated with gambling or high stakes events and so on. It's quite well represented across a bunch of different sorts of literature, like studies around gambling behavior and also sports people and ritual performances and so on, right? So I do think there is support in certain cases. In other ones, it's more speculative and less empirically grounded. And whether the intuitions that we observe in this data set map cleanly onto the actual like functional outcomes of performing those rituals, I think is an open question. So like, for example, there is research around confessional rituals and the effect that they have on people in terms of their alleviating anxiety or religious identification. And it does appear from research that like taking part in confessions serves anxiety alleviating functions and so on. But does that mean that those rituals are the most effective out of all the ones we looked at for that? I think those kind of things are harder to answer. So it's a mixed bag, and our data do not prove that like the intuitions are valid. We were mostly just interested in, are the intuitions consistent between cultures or not, right? Or do they reflect? That was our main topic of interest. But in terms of just so stories, what I mean by that is that in a lot of the cases, the evolutionary story that is presented around the ritual functions is very often very compelling and backed up with, case studies, anecdotal examples, references to where you can see a clear connection between particular rituals and particular collective action problems. But exactly as you asked with your first question, whether that relates to a like cross-culturally recurrent pattern or one that is documented in the archaeological literature, I think is often like a much more contested question. So we should be wary of people making very nice theories that don't have robust empirical tests. And if you, I kind of want to emphasize that like if people are building theories that what we want them to be doing is like generating predictions which allow us to predict data in advance and which contrast with other theories, like very basic things, but in many occasions the theories are so big and covering so many different things that they often can incorporate almost any result as relating to like some feature. So this is an issue, I think, in terms of theory construction, that you want to be able to falsify things. So
I
it's
see.
yeah, that's all I meant by it.
I see. So can I add one more quick question? So about the first question related to that, do you or maybe do people in your field have specific prediction about which ritual would be more powerful in specific like function or specific domain of like, more personalized rituals versus big religion type rituals? Like it could be different for each specific domain. So that's I'm kind of
Yeah.
starting to use the word evolutionary psychology, but you can have specific prediction based on evo-psych in terms of like which ritual will be more powerful in this domain versus not this domain, etc. So do people have that kind of prediction?
They do. And the one that I'm most familiar with that's most related to my work is that rituals which are like highly arousing, low frequency, dramatic,
Right,
painful, dysphoric,
right.
that like in those cases, for example, that you expect to see very tight relational bonds between the people that perform the ritual, but not so broadly dispersed bonds towards the relevant community. The prediction is also that that generates a particular type of group bonding, a relationally focused one that Bill Swan has emphasized called identity fusion, as opposed to like categorical type bonding. So there is the prediction that if you get dysphoric rituals and that you will see like smaller, more intense bonds with communities, that you will also be able to motivate more extreme actions from people that participate in them or observe them. So there are. It's not that there aren't any predictions or associations, but it's just that like because rituals are so diverse and there's so many different types that it's if people come up with like general theories of ritual, it has to accommodate so much stuff. And I think in general, the better approach is to like make very specific predictions, as you've just highlighted, about specific type of rituals, specific things that you predict them to be associated with, and then we can go and test it and look at whether that's the case.
I see. Yeah, I saw that in your slide, and what I meant by specificity is that like specific, it's not about like the cost or like the frequency, but more specifically like maybe washing your hands maybe more functional for this one versus like precision will be more functional for this type of like cohesion, etc. Some specific like actual specific rituals. What are they for?
Yes, yes. So that would be things like divination being associated with like risky resource extraction, and like in-group distrust and factionalism being associated with like confession or anxiety alleviating rituals associated with like washing type rituals. So there are those connections, but
Okay.
they're not always perfectly spelled out, and probably not well spelled out by me in this talk, but yes.
Okay, I see. So there are some prediction there, and you can test that then in the future.
Yes,
Cool.
yes.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris, again. And thank you all coming. I guess the time is already, yeah, half past 8. So yeah, let's call it a day. Thanks, Chris, for joining us in this late in the evening. It was an amazing talk.
Thanks for inviting me and the questions. I appreciate everybody
Yeah,
bearing with me for so long.
let's yeah. Let's talk more about our like Hokkaido firework data at some point.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of unpublished data, unfortunately, but yeah.
Looking forward. Okay, thank you all. Our next session will be in 2 months. So until next time, see you all and have a good rest of the day.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Sorry, Chris. So
Oh.
what do you have in your mind about recording?